My people, something historic just happened in Madagascar. For weeks, young people, most of them under 25, have been flooding the streets. They weren't carrying guns, they were carrying smartphones, flags, and a whole lot of hope. It started with water cuts and blackouts, the kind of everyday struggle that most African youth know too well. But that frustration quickly turned into a movement. And then this week, everything exploded. The army flipped, the president fled the country, and now the armed forces are officially in control of the state. That's right, Madagascar's Gen Z didn't just start a protest, they triggered a full-blown political earthquake. But here's the thing, this isn't just about Madagascar. This is about a whole generation across Africa, a generation that's tired of being ignored, dismissed, and told to wait their turn. They're not waiting anymore. They're rising. So today, we're breaking down how Gen Z, a generation born into broken systems, just brought down a president and pushed a military takeover, and what it tells us about the future of power on the African continent. This is the Breakdown.
We will take power starting today and dissolve, starting today, the Senate, the High Constitutional Court, the High Court of Justice, the High Council for the Defense of Democracy and the Rule of Law, and the Independent National Electoral Commission. There you go, the National Assembly. We let it work, we continue to work, and that's it.
Now, before we get into what's happening on the streets right now, let's take a moment to understand Madagascar, a country most people only know for lemurs, rainforests, and movie memes, but whose reality tells a much deeper story. Madagascar is the world's fourth largest island. That's right, sitting off the southeastern coast of Africa, home to about 30 million people, most of them under the age of 25. It's rich in minerals, vanilla, and rare biodiversity, yet nearly 75% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. Despite being democratic on paper, politics here has been messy. Coups, contested elections, and the same leaders recycling power for decades. The island nation gained independence from France in 1960, filled with optimism and the promise of a new beginning. But like many post-colonial states, that promise quickly collided with politics, poverty, and power struggles. The country's first president, Philibert Tsiranana, tried to maintain close ties with France, a decision that sparked resentment among nationalists who felt that Madagascar never really broke free. By 1972, mass protests, led mostly by students and workers, forced Tsiranana out. The military stepped in, beginning a long cycle of coups and caretaker regimes that would define Madagascar's modern history. In 1975, the socialist military leader Didier Ratsiraka took power, promising an authentic revolution. But what followed was 20 years of state control, isolation, and economic decline. Now, by the 1990s, corruption was rampant. The economy was in free fall, and Madagascar had become one of the poorest countries in the world. Since then, every attempt at democracy has been short-lived. The 2001 elections triggered a political crisis that split the country. And in 2009, a young disc jockey turned mayor, Andry Rajoelina, led a movement that ousted the sitting president, Marc Ravalomanana, with the support of, you guessed it, the military. Now, he was just 34 at the time. People called him the face of a new generation. But what began as hope slowly turned into deja vu. Over the next decade, Rajoelina became the very thing he once opposed, consolidating power, sidelining opponents, and presiding over worsening poverty. Today, Madagascar ranks among the 10 poorest countries in the world. Nearly 75% of its 30 million people live on less than $2 a day. Basic services like electricity, healthcare, and clean water are unreliable, even in the capital. And with a median age of 19, it's a country of young people growing up in darkness, literally and figuratively. So when the lights went out again this September, it wasn't just about power cuts. It was about a generation that finally refused to stay powerless. That's how the spark was lit.
For weeks, young protesters, largely members of what's being called Gen Z Madagascar, have been on the streets demanding change. Their anger, a response to chronic electricity and water shortages, corruption and high unemployment.
My people, every revolution starts with something small. In Madagascar, it started with the lights going out. That's right. Now, for those of you who don't know, that means power cuts every single day. Not because of hurricanes or storms, but because the system just doesn't work. Imagine trying to run a business, study for an exam, or even cook dinner in the dark. That's the reality on the ground. And for young people who've grown up their entire lives in that darkness, literal and political, this blackout was the final spark. By late September, rolling blackouts and water shortages had become unbearable. In the capital, entire neighborhoods went dark for hours, sometimes days, while prices for food and transport kept climbing. Students couldn't study. Shops couldn't open. Families were fetching water from roadside pipes. And that's when young people said, enough. Now, at first, it looked like any ordinary protest, right? Small crowds, handwritten cards, a few angry chants. But something different was happening this time. The organizers weren't politicians or party loyalists. They were TikTokers, students, gamers, young professionals, a new generation calling themselves Gen Z Madagascar. They formed groups with names like Leo de l'Estage, meaning fed up with load shedding, and Shimanaiki Lembenana, we refuse to be trampled. Their language was bold, creative, and fearless. Now, on social media, they mocked the government's excuses with memes and videos that went viral. They used hashtags like Aokalze, meaning that's enough. Now, I'm doing my best here with, the language, so please bear with me. But here's the thing, within days, what began as a few dozen protesters in the capital spread across the country. Students, teachers, even factory workers joining in. The demands grew louder. Fix the power grid, end corruption, create jobs. Come on, give us a future. It was no longer about water or electricity. It became about dignity, about a generation that had grown up in a democracy but had never actually seen democracy work for them. And the government's response? Well, the same old playbook. Tear gas, arrests, intimidation. But this time, it backfired. Because for every protester the police tried to silence, 1,000 more picked up their phones and live streamed the truth. The movement wasn't dying. It was multiplying. And as the chants grew louder, the world began to take notice. What no one expected next was that the very people paid to defend the president would soon turn against him.
Mametraka ireo rafitra fanavaozana nasionaly. Hamaly ny etaetan'ny vahoaka malagasy amin'ny famerenana ny demokrasia, ny fanarenana ny fitokisana amin'ireo androm-panjakana, ary ny fananganana fitondrana miorina amin'ny rariny tsara tantana ary manao tamberina ndraikitra amin'ny vahoaka. Araka izany, dia atsahatra ny asan'ireo androm-panjakana voatanisa ao amin'ny lalam-panorenana tamin'ny 14
On October 11th, the elite military unit known as CAPSAT, the same force that once protected the president, suddenly announced that they were switching sides. They said they could no longer stand by while the government brutalized its own people. Within hours, soldiers were seen marching with the protesters, not against them. So think about that. The same uniforms that once represented fear now stood for freedom, for hope. Crowds cheered, people cried, and for a brief moment, the streets of Madagascar felt united. The people and the army, side by side. But that unity came with a cost. The government began to crumble. On October 13th, President Andry Rajoelina fled the country, reportedly aboard a French military aircraft, saying that his life was in danger. He later appeared in a video claiming that he was still in control, calling the protest a coup attempt. But it was too late. The next day, the National Assembly impeached him, and the military official announced that it was taking control of the state. Colonel Michael Randrianirina, speaking on national television, declared that the armed forces were dissolving government institutions to, quote, restore order and stability. And just like that, Madagascar's Gen Z revolution had become a military takeover. The same system that the youth rose up against now had a new face, wearing a uniform. The question was no longer if change would come, but what kind of change it would be. My people, what's happening in Madagascar isn't just politics, right? It's a mirror reflecting the frustration, the hunger, and the hope of an entire generation. Now, let's be clear. This wasn't about one president. It was about a pattern. Across Africa, from Morocco to Kenya, Nigeria to the DRC, young people are rising, not because they hate their countries, but because they love them enough to demand better. Madagascar's Gen Z didn't grow up under colonization. They grew up under corruption, underdevelopment, and broken promises. They've watched leaders come and go, all pledging the same thing, transformation, yet delivering the same thing, poverty, and the same excuses. This generation has had enough of being patient. They're digital, they're global, and they're fearless. They organize on TikTok, mobilize on WhatsApp, and broadcast their truth on Instagram Live, turning smartphones into megaphones for justice. They may not have traditional leaders or political parties, but what they do have is a shared language, a deep, burning desire to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. In Madagascar, they called it Auka Ize. That's enough. And that phrase, that emotion, echoes across the continent. In Senegal, it was Faz Yumbez. In Nigeria, it was End SARS. In Kenya, it was Reject Finance Bill. Different countries, different triggers, but the same old story. A young, restless Africa, tired of being managed, tired of being told to wait your turn, tired of leaders who treat nations like personal estates. But here's the thing. Protests can topple power, but they can't build systems. And that's the next frontier for this generation. Because the question now isn't whether Gen Z can start revolutions. They've already proven that they can. The question is, can they finish them? Can they turn outrage into organization, energy into real institutions, and hashtags into actual governance? Because the future of this continent will depend on it. My people, every revolution reaches a crossroads. You know, in Madagascar, that moment is right now. The youth have done what many thought was impossible. They've shaken a system that seemed untouchable. But here's the truth. The fall of a president is not the same as the rise of a nation. Right now, Madagascar's armed forces are in control. Colonel Michael Randrianirina told reporters that a committee led by the military would rule the country for a period of up to 2 years alongside a transitional government before organizing new elections. But we've heard that promise before, and we know how those stories go. When the military steps in to protect democracy, democracy rarely comes back the same. And that's the paradox of people power, right? You can create a vacuum that the very forces you were fighting are more than happy to fill. And yet, there's something different this time. Madagascar's Gen Z isn't celebrating blindly. They're organizing. They're watching. They're documenting every move the new rulers make. This isn't a movement looking for saviors. It's a generation learning how to hold power accountable. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change begins. Not with perfect leaders, but with the people who refuse to stop demanding better. Because if there's one thing this moment proves, it's that Africa's youth are not the leaders of tomorrow. They are the conscience of today. And their fight in Madagascar and beyond is shaping what the next chapter of African democracy will look like. Now, the revolution may be unfinished, but it's undeniably underway.
We started hearing about demonstrations happening in the southern part of Tunisia. As we were traveling not too far from the region, we heard of what happened to Bouazizi, and then it just kept on growing.
Now, if all of this feels familiar, well, that's because we've seen it before. In 2011, a young man in Tunisia set himself on fire after being humiliated by police. And his death ignited what became known as the Arab Spring, a wave of youth-led revolt that swept across North Africa and the Middle East. Millions took to the streets in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, and Syria, demanding the same things young people in Madagascar are demanding today: jobs, dignity, justice, and a government that listens. For a moment, it felt like a new dawn. Presidents who had ruled for decades fell. Crowds celebrated in city squares. The world watched and called it the Facebook Revolution. But then came the aftermath. In Egypt, the military took power, promising elections, then tightening control. In Libya and Yemen, chaos and civil war. In Syria, tragedy on a scale that the world is still trying to comprehend. And across much of the region, the very systems that were overthrown slowly reemerged, sometimes stronger, sometimes more brutal. So what went wrong? The Arab Spring taught us a hard truth that you can remove a leader in a week, but it takes a generation to build institutions or to rebuild institutions. It showed us that passion alone isn't enough. You need plans, you need leadership, you need structures that can outlast the protest. And that's the lesson Madagascar's Gen Z must remember now. They've done the hard part, waking up a nation. But the harder part is staying awake. It's about turning viral energy into viable strategy. Because without structure, revolutions risk becoming echoes, loud at first, then fading into silence. Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, is the perfect example. It was the one country that seemed to succeed, building a new constitution and holding free elections. But even there, democracy is now fragile, challenged by economic hardship and rising authoritarianism. So for Madagascar, the choice is clear. Learn from history or repeat it. Gen Z has shown that they can bring down a president. Now they must prove that they can build a nation. Because real change isn't made in the streets alone. It's made in the systems that survive long after the hashtags stop trending. So where do we go from here, my people? What happens next in Madagascar will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another chapter in the same old book. Because history has shown us when the military steps in without a clear roadmap, hope can quickly turn into heartbreak. So here's what should happen now. Well, first, there must be transparency. The military must present a clear public timetable for transition, not vague promises of up to 2 years, but specific milestones, constitutional reform, national dialogue, elections, etc. Second, Gen Z needs a seat at the table. The very youth who led this movement must not be sidelined. They need representation in whatever transitional council or civic dialogue is formed, because real legitimacy doesn't come from uniforms. It comes from the people. And third, civil society must step up. Yes, the churches, unions, universities, and the press have to act as watchdogs, documenting every decision, every delay, every promise broken, and keeping people accountable. This isn't time for silence. It's the time for vigilance. Fourth, Africa must pay attention. The African Union and regional bodies need to engage now, not just to condemn, but to help guide a peaceful and democratic transition. Because if Madagascar succeeds in turning protest into reform, it could become a blueprint for youth-led transformation across Africa. But if it fails, it could become another warning that revolutions without institutions only recycle the same power in different hands. So this is the moment to build, not just react, to turn energy into structure, outrage into organization, and hope into governance. And maybe, if done right, Madagascar's blackout will light a spark for the whole continent. Because when Gen Z says enough, it shouldn't end with protest signs. It should begin with policy, with power, and with a plan. So, my people, from Tunisia to Madagascar, one truth remains. The struggle for dignity never dies. Every generation has its breaking point. For some, our great-grandparents, it was colonialism. For others, it was dictatorship. And for this generation, it's corruption, inequality, and the quiet betrayal of their dreams. What we're witnessing in Madagascar is not an isolated story. It's part of a bigger African awakening, a generation that's no longer asking for permission. They're taking ownership. They've shown courage in the streets. Now comes the harder part, showing character in rebuilding what's been broken. Because power doesn't change nations. It's people who do. Institutions don't reform themselves, right? Citizens have to demand it. And hashtags, they're great. They spark a movement, but they don't make history. Hard work does. Vision does. Strategy does. Madagascar's revolution is still unfolding, but its message is already echoing across the continent. We will not live in darkness forever. The symbolism of that. And if Africa's young people can learn from history, from the Arab Spring, from Sudan, from Burkina Faso, then maybe this time the revolution won't end in disappointment. Maybe this time it'll end in design, with systems that work, leaders that listen, and a future built by the very people who demanded it. So now I turn it over to you, my people. Do you believe Africa's Gen Z, the future, can turn this moment into the spark that changes everything? Or will history repeat itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it. And share this episode with someone who needs to see it. And let's keep the conversation going. That's it for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Sandra Babu-Boateng. And until next time, take care. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, I want to invite you to join our family here at PanaGenius TV and be a part of conversations that are shaping the future. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for alerts. And if you want to support our work and help us reach more people, you can drop a super thanks on this video or join our growing membership community. Thank you so much for your support.